Well, thank you very much. I'm going to switch gears here a little bit. While I work on restoration projects, I do it in a different way than I think many of you, mostly on the water policy side. And I work extensively with NGOs in the basin as well as with a number of the large water managers and water utilities in the 7 states, the U.S. and Mexico, on water issues in the basin. Can you guys hear me okay? And what Tamara's Coalition had asked me to provide a little context with regard to what's happening at the moment with water in this basin and how that is going to probably change the conversation around water in the years to come in a way that I think will be pretty relevant to all of us that are working and care about restoration in the West. So I'm sure you've all seen this, but Colorado River Basin, 35 million people, 4 million acres of farmland, easily the most heavily regulated river system in the world, and also one that is characterized by extreme sort of variability, with a stream flow that varies anywhere between around 5 million acre feet to as much as 25 million acre feet. It's also a basin which has grown up in terms of its water use. This is a graph put out by the Bureau of Reclamation showing basin-wide water supply is the blue line, and red is water demand. And as you can see, as of around 2003, human use in the basin now substantially exceeds supply. And that is the sort of new world that we've been facing. Up until recently, we hadn't really seen the effects of that sort of overuse and overallocation. But starting in the end of the 90s and moving into the early part of 2000s, we began to see what that begins to look like. This was Lake Powell in 1999. Many of you have seen these pictures before. That was Lake Powell in 2004. And this really helped to change the conversation about water in the basin, from a conversation mostly about how we divide up the surplus water to a conversation about how we manage vulnerability and risk and potential shortage. Those risks have driven a lot of conversations in this basin. They've been a big driver behind the agreement reached between the 7 basin states in 2007 that changed the way the Colorado River was managed, and also in a recent agreement between the U.S. and Mexico that many of you have probably heard of, Minute 319, in which we've essentially tried to build a new partnership between the 2 countries to face the challenges of water shortages. It's also driven a lot of new conversation and study in the basin, notably the Colorado River Basin Study, which was released by the Bureau of Reclamation back at the end of 2012, which was a really unique process, 2 years of collaborative effort among many of the major stakeholders in the basin, probably the most comprehensive analysis of a river ever done on a basin scale, pretty much anywhere, looking at growth scenarios for municipal, agricultural, industrial needs that were developed by each state, looking at supply scenarios, and not just the historical last 100 years that we've always worked with, but also downscaling global climate models to try and really predict what could potentially happen in this basin. That resulted in, ultimately, a preparation of a whole series of scenarios of what the future might look like, as well as evaluating almost 160 different solutions submitted by stakeholders to think about how we might deal with it. I won't go into these in detail, but these are just some of the results of the study showing on the water supply side, looking at different scenarios for the future. The blue this guy here is basically what we've seen over the last 100 years compared to what we may see in the future. The boxes here basically represent what we would normally expect to see here in the historic record, here in looking back further in time, and here with the results of global climate models. And what I think is just mostly useful to note here is that the amount of uncertainty increases dramatically from what we've experienced in the past to what we might experience in the future. And in fact, this drought, this is the last 20 years approximate of average stream flow in the Colorado River Basin. And in fact, what we've experienced over the last 20 years is in fact pretty close to the middle of what the global climate models might predict to be the sort of new normal. So that what we have been calling a drought might be more like what we can expect to see in the future. The study also, I think, showed some significant deviation between our expected growth in the amount of water supply, or water demand, which is in the red bar, as well compared to what we can expect to see in terms of water supply. And what I think the sort of big takeaways from that were that climate change potentially has a really dramatic impact on this system, but even without climate change, you can expect to see a significant imbalance between supply and demand, and some significant risks that I'll talk about in a minute. The overall imbalance was estimated to be on the order of around 3 million acre feet on the sort of average case, as bad as 8 million acre feet, which is about half of the total water use in the basin currently. That's hardest on Arizona and California. And while you can meet the majority of imbalances through conservation and land management changes and reuse, those are going to have significant costs that are going to change the way that people have to think and talk about water going forward. One of the other sort of key findings of this is with regard to vulnerability. And this, again, I won't go through these, but this is just a table that the Bureau put together looking at sort of what they would see as the risks in every year with regard to a whole bunch of different values, and then some portfolios of different solutions applied against those risks to see how we could improve them. And what's important to take away from this is that while under baseline conditions, there's a lot of risk going into the future, even when we implement all the solutions that were considered, we can't eliminate those risks. And as a result of that, we really have to begin to think and manage water differently to be able to accommodate increasing amounts of uncertainty. And those vulnerabilities that are talked about in the study will really importantly affect streams and riparian areas because they set up what are potentially pretty important trade-offs between human uses and riparian areas throughout the West. There's a lot of work going on through that study process, which is ongoing. An environmental recreational flows work group, which is tasked with actually trying to figure out how we might be able to do better with integrating environmental and recreational values in the context of a changing system with increased vulnerability. And that is actually going to be looking specifically at some rivers to look at options that could be considered on a basin-wide scale. We're getting presently, though, a nice preview of what some of those vulnerabilities look like. And this is just a graph showing total system storage in the Colorado River. As a result of the recent drought, overall system storage capacity is now at the lowest level it's ever been since Lake Powell was originally constructed and began to fill. And that is primarily as a result of drought over the last few years, but again, as a result of what we see in the future, that may in fact be more like normal conditions going forward. I'm just going to put a couple of graphs from reclamation up. These are some projections about where the river could go or where the lakes could go if the current drought continues. This is a graph of where Lake Powell may end up. The yellow line is essentially project what would happen if just the current conditions we've seen for the last 10 years were to persist. As you can see, Powell can drop pretty dramatically and ultimately end up no longer producing power even within just a couple of years at Glen Canyon Dam. The same thing is true at Lake Mead, in some ways a little worse. And what's notable here is that in addition to what could happen to the lake, this is the average sort of 50% scenario. And even under the 50% scenario, sort of what we would expect to see on average, that's not a good outcome. We essentially end up with shortages in the lower basin that can potentially persist for some time. I'm just going to pull out the Lake Mead elevation just for a second, just to sort of talk about what that could mean. This is that same line that we were looking at on the lower end. And essentially, within just a few years, again, this is not certain to occur, but it could occur. You can go through a series of shortage triggers that will result in serious reductions in water use in the lower basin that will be forced on users at these three levels. And we actually blow through all of the protections we built into the reservoir system within just a few years. Hoover Dam stops producing power right at this line. And Las Vegas begins to suffer from the inability to move water to their urban area. Some of their intakes become stranded also around this level. They're busily drilling a new one at the bottom of Lake Mead in hopes of staving that off. And under recent projection is they may only have a few months of sort of slack time in their engineering schedule to get that done. It also, I think, points to one of the sort of interesting things that's going on, which is really going to change the conversation. Lake Mead, this behavior, which as you can see is sort of definitely down, is driven primarily by the amount of water use that's going on. It's not actually related much to hydrology. Basically, there's more water use in the lower basin going on than the river will really support. And any year that the lower basin doesn't get extra water from the upper basin from releases from Lake Powell, Lake Mead will predictably drop 13 to 20 feet. And so most of this trend is lower basin water use. That little uptick was a good snowpack. But it essentially just resets the system, and we continue on this downward trend. What that sort of fundamentally means is that we're at a point where, and I think you can see it in the earlier graph, where human water use sort of exceeds what the system can yield for the first time. We're at a point now where we can't really develop new water in this basin. And this is a nice slide put together by Brad Udall, which I think describes in one slide pretty much the whole policy conversation in the basin. But essentially, lower basin users gradually, as the situation gets worse, there's less supply over time, more use of water, particularly in the upper basin over time. That results in lower basin users being squeezed because they have to begin to cut back and eliminate that deficit that exists in Lake Mead. Upper basin users simultaneously beginning to experience that squeeze because they can't, they've physically developed more water than's really there, and the increasing risk begins to catch up with those users. That's driving some very new conversations in this basin. And it's resulted in things like 2007 guidelines and the Minute 319 agreement, both of which are a real step forward in terms of working together and collaborating in water management. It's also driving a lot of conversations about how can we think about how to align the interests of environmental needs, riparian restoration, with the interests of downstream and upstream users that are facing these pressures. And it's driven a great deal of collaboration. And so far, the federal government, state governments, many of the major water users and NGOs have really been pulling together in the face of this and beginning to collaborate in new ways to work on this problem. And the pressure has changed the conversation from one where we're all fighting for a water supply and instead trying to figure out how we can all share it. There's a growing list of those examples, and I think we're going to need to continue those conversations, because what we're also learning in this system is we really don't have time for conflict anymore. We also can't afford zero-sum outcomes, because essentially all of these resources under extraordinary pressure and we can't continue to push the environment any further without getting into more trouble under our environmental laws. We can't really push our municipal users any further without causing economic disruptions. We can't just count on the fact that we'll take all the water from farmers. And so, at least from a standpoint of riparian restoration, I think there's actually this, as sort of scary as the situation is, it is really opening some new opportunities for different kinds of conversations about how to manage water than we've been able to have before, and created a much more open dialogue between environmental interests, municipal interests, and farming interests than I think we've had the opportunity to have before. Some good news on the Colorado River is in the Snowpack this year. This is off of the Bureau's website as of yesterday. We're having a pretty good year so far, although it's a little too early to tell how it's going to go. The next few months will pretty much tell the tale. But if we sort of continue on the current trend, that'll lower the risk of shortages in the lower basin, which we're thinking could happen as soon as 2016. We may be able to buy another year, or even more if we have another good snow year next year. That, I think, is really good news because it gives us additional time to begin to implement some near-term solutions, as well as sort of continue the collaborative efforts over the last few years that have produced things like Minute 319. On the other hand, I think the system really stands balanced on sort of the point of a knife. With storage as low as it is now, even just 1 or 2 bad years are enough to drive that Lake Mead level down, create challenges for Las Vegas, create challenges for the Central Arizona project in Arizona, create challenges for users in the upper basin. And it really, I think, will serve hopefully as a wake-up call that we need to really continue the conversation about how to get to long-term solutions. So that's all I had. Any questions?
Any questions for Peter? Let us know your topic with some time to do that. It was so sobering. I was getting in that time. I hope he was being positive on last night. Okay, thank you so much.
I have one question.
Sure.
And this may be suggesting the opening of a big fat evil can of worms. So if it isn't, you don't want to get into it, just tell me. With all of this information regarding the potential risk of shortages showing up as soon as 2016, are there any conversations going on between the upper and lower basins regarding a rewrite of some of the Colorado River water law?
There are a lot of conversations going on between the upper and lower basin. In fact, this has driven, I think, more conversation than I've seen since I've started working on this topic 14 years ago or so. I don't think that it will result in a rewrite of the law. In fact, what the experience over the last few years has been is that in many ways it's far too late to try and fix things like the 1922 Colorado River Compact that drives a lot of these problems. Because in many ways we don't have time to fight about it. And instead the trend has been towards trying to implement solutions which sort of overlay on top of the existing law of the river and sort of voluntarily pursue a better outcome by working together. The Minute 319 agreement with U.S. and Mexico is a great example of that. The Treaty of 1944 between the U.S. and Mexico is, it was written in 1944. It was written in the context of World War II. It was not designed to think about a lot of the things that we want to think about today. Certainly the environment, shortages, we didn't even worry about shortages back then. None of that stuff was present in the treaty. But rather than rewriting the treaty, what we effectively have done is written an agreement that rides on top of it and which now implements a shortage sharing program, a surplus sharing program, new reservoir management, where we're cooperating and treating Mexico as a partner as opposed to an adversary, and an environmental flow program which was completely not contemplated back in the 1940s. The environment wasn't even on the radar screen, which actually we learned as of yesterday. That program has now been approved, and starting in March, there'll be a binational release of water into the Colorado River Delta to experiment with riparian restoration in the Delta. So I think the agreements, if I had to sort of predict how it's going to go, they'll trend more in that direction.
So there would be more along the lines of ongoing amendments is what it sounds like after taking place, as opposed to what would there would have to be an attempt to rewrite the law.
Exactly.
On top of it and amending it to be, I guess, more realistic with today's conditions.
And more flexible, and hopefully to embrace a broader range of interests. For example, there are potentially great alignments between environmental interests and interests in doing stream restoration and increasing flows throughout the upper basin, and the interests of keeping the reservoirs higher and protecting hydropower revenues, protecting against shortages to the major municipal users. So I would expect to see more of that, and that I think is really the opportunity that's offered at the present moment. Yeah, well, we need in some ways a sort of, like to say, a Goldilocks snowpack, like dire enough to keep the pressure on, but not so dire that we all start fighting with each other.
Okay.
Sure.